The light was nothing like we see with our eyes. Like I try to describe it so many times. It was yellow, blue, gold, white, it was so many different colors all at once. And it was flowing just like constantly in movement. And they were made up of light, that was flowing through them. And their eyes were what really just like blew me away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ask Julie Ryan Show. It's where we blend spirituality and practicality to help you live a life of purpose and joy. Today, we have Tricia Barker on the show. Tricia's a college professor who experienced an NDE while in surgery, and she's here to discuss how dying taught her about healing. I'm eager to hear her story and, among other things, see if it correlates with the spiritual activities I've experienced in the operating room. Please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with your family and friends. Now let's go talk with Tricia. Tricia, welcome to the show. I'm so delighted to have you join us today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, wonderful. You had a near-death experience. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's one of those, quote, horrible things that made everything so much better. I think some of us are stubborn, and it was in many ways, I think, fated, because I wouldn't have woken up any other way. There are people who have these nice awakenings, and I'm almost jealous of them, where they're, walking through nature, or they're at a conference and they just have this feeling of oneness. No, I had to get hit over the head and taken to the hospital, and it was a 17-hour wait, a head-on collision almost, on my way to run the Austin 10K. And it was horrific physically. My back was broken in several places, and I had lost feeling in one of my legs. And there was, a lot of fear at a physical level. And I remember thinking, and I was agnostic at the time, I just remember thinking, let me be able to take care of myself. Let me be able to, if I'm disabled, let me be able to at least have enough wherewithal and enough physical strength to make it through this life. And there wasn't so much fear about dying. There was just fear about how I was going to make it through life at that point. And yet there was a slight fear of death when they told me 17% chance of death when I signed away, my life, because there were some internal injuries. And I remember thinking, I'm young, I don't think I'll die. I was so surprised at the minute I lifted up out of my body. And as soon as they put the mask over me, the next thing I was aware of is that I was outside of my body, and they must have had me under for quite some time, because my back was opened up and my hip was opened up. And in those days, they took bone from the hip and they replaced that in the back area. And so I saw all this blood, and I remember thinking, that's odd. That looks like a little abnormal that there would be that much blood on the table. And I remember looking at that first, but also realizing immediately, we go on. This is my spirit form looking at my body. And I felt so much clearer than in my body. And as an agnostic, I placed so much value on the brain. I was in college at the time, and I thought, the brain was everything. And many of my friends were atheist or agnostic, and I thought I could convince them. I thought this moment outside of form would be everything. I thought, okay, this is convincing, but it was convincing to me. I found out, not necessarily to them, but to me, it changed my entire paradigm. I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew that we go on. I knew that in this moment, I saw the world differently. But not only that, there were angels at the foot of the bed. And these angels were about 8 or 9 feet tall, and they were magnificent. They were not like anything, quote, biblical or anything I'd ever seen or imagined before. They were energy beings, not really male or female, but they just communicated with light through their eyes. They were beautiful. I described them as like a really beautiful man or a really strong woman. Like they just were amazing. And they calmed me down. There was this sense of, I knew there were messengers of a higher intelligence, and I knew that they were healers and that they were healing both my soul and my body. And they sent this light through the doctors and through the surgeons and through their hands and into my body and also into my soul. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm going to walk, I'm going to run. And I'd lost feeling in one of my legs. And they said, it's going to be fine. And they were showing me where they'd pick the bone fragments out, or where the bone fragments would be picked out, and where my spine would recover and it would all be fine. And I remember going, oh, cool. And I just sort of saw in the future that I'd run very quickly, within a year after that accident, and just feeling relief and joy. And then the monitor flatlined. And then I thought, oh, technically I'm dead. So that was all out of body. And then I recognized that sound and knew, that was death. And I saw the anesthesiologist and others kind of step back at that point, like, oh, now we have to deal, with the dying body. And I was like, I don't want to watch that. And there's other things to see, in this realm. And I remember knowing I could go through the walls. And someone said to me recently, or I read it in a book, that this world looks differently as a spirit, as if it's less real. I just thought, this looked like theater. And I know that's a weird way of looking at it, but it just looked like, oh, the eternal truth is a soul. The eternal truth is this is what goes on forever. And we forget we're playing roles here. We forget that we're just embodying something that's temporary. But at the same time, it is kind of odd to go through walls, to make this conscious decision of, okay, I'm going through this first wall, and then, okay, the second wall. And you use your consciousness to move quickly. And I saw my stepdad get a candy bar in the waiting room. And this became a verifiable detail that lots of researchers like. But to me, I barely knew him at that moment in time. And I just thought, oh, well, my mom married this guy while I was in college. Hope they, get along and have fun and, have a good marriage. It didn't matter that much to me. I just thought it was funny that he was eating sugar because they were real, they're health nuts, and so I thought that was amusing. And then the next thing I knew, I was over Austin and I felt this love for all people. And I think that's an important point, that we spend so much time not realizing how much we do love other people. And at a basic level, we are love. And we hear that all the time. But the minute we shed this form, we just really know it. That is who we are, is love. And I'm launching into the story without, letting you jump in too much. Do you have any questions, or do you want to stop me?
Yeah, several already. Several already. So when you said that you were going through walls, were the walls, they were the actual walls in through surgery and in the hospital, it sounds like, because you were in the waiting area, for the surgical waiting area for the families, seeing your stepdad, it sounds like, and all of that. It sounded like you were out of your body before you flatlined.
Yes.
Okay. So tell us about that. When they put you under with the anesthesia, they had opened up your back, you were bleeding profusely, obviously, in the operating room. And that's when you witnessed your spirit being outside of your body.
Yeah, it's like I became my spirit and I saw my body. So at that point, I think my consciousness was my spirit. And later I learned that I bled to death, so that it was my internal injuries that caused my death, and that I was dead for 2.5 minutes, and they had to cauterize a lot of veins, and they didn't know how I really kind of came back. That, it's kind of shocking, like they didn't expect that. And so the blood that I saw was kind of accurate, because the internal injuries after a car wreck were the thing that everyone was dancing around. They just didn't know what they were, how bad they were. They knew that there were some. And so, yeah, it was technically an out-of-body experience until the monitor flatlined, and then it was near-death experience. And
yeah. Were you up above your body? Were you kind of like up above the whole scene watching it? Were you standing off to the side? Where were you positioned when you were watching your body and the surgeons frantically working to save your life?
Yeah, so it was above and kind of to the right of it. And then I lowered down a little bit about eye level with the angels. And so at first I was way above looking down, at the doctors. And then I wanted to just see the angels because they were so amazing. Like there's something, they weren't anything like paintings I had seen. And I keep reimagining them and and now I'm playing with AI, trying to get as close to the images as I can because, I want to duplicate them, like it's just an image that's seared into my brain forever.
Yeah. Well, and with you being an atheist, were you raised in a religion or
I was raised in a very dogmatic religion, and my parents, my mom ended up divorcing my dad, but they were very unhappy. And so I think I looked at my parents' unhappiness and some of the abuse from my mom, and I thought, ooh, religion isn't necessarily helping them lead better lives. And also there was a lot of poverty. And so to me, as this teenager, I was like, well, I want to be wealthy and I want to have a happy marriage, and religion didn't seem to bring that to these people. So let's just, put that aside and let's move in the direction of education. And education was the thing that was like my savior in a way. And so that's pretty much all I placed any value on was education and material things. And so my plan was to go into law school, which all changed.
so the education was your ticket out of the life that you were living as a child? I was raised Roman Catholic, 12 years at Catholic schools. And so I was taught that angels are 6 to 7 to 8 feet tall, to your point. And they are light beings, but they have big wings and they're wearing a white robe and it's belted at the waist and all of that. Now, I understand at this point that that's based on my frame of reference as how I was taught angels look. So the fact that you were able to get past that and say, okay, these are light beings, which we've heard, but it's kind of hard even now. You're saying you're trying to use AI to replicate what you saw. It's kind of hard to get over that. Okay, angels have big wings and blah, blah, blah. I had a guy who was an angel communicator on the show. I think it was last year or perhaps the year before. And he said that. He said that the way that the light shines on them, that they just look like light beings. And he understands how maybe the artists of many years ago would have depicted wings. And then it's the old telephone game, right? You believe what people have said over long periods of time.
And then, the traveling through, space very quickly, or the speed of light, like how do they do that?
Right.
Like wings, or, how do they travel in that way? And then the robes too, the light kind of undulated. It's not like they were naked, but it's not like they were really wearing clothes. So I can kind of see robes in a way because the light the light was nothing like we see with our eyes. Like I try to describe it so many times. It was yellow, blue, gold, white, it was so many different colors all at once. And it was flowing that, just like constantly in movement. And they were made up of light, that was flowing through them. And their eyes were what really just like blew me away. And they were just the beginning, of the near-death experience. There was, so much more to it, but they were the first thing that was so out of this world, honestly, that just kind of floored me. And honestly, I really hoped that the surgeons could feel them. Now, many years later, I have heard of surgeons who use their angels and work with them. My surgeons were not aware, that the angels were working through them, which is kind of cool in a way too, that they can work through people who are unaware.
Well, I think it's cool too that you talk about pulsating light, which is energy, and all energy is moving. We're taught that in science classes when we're about 8 or 9, everything's made out of energy and it's constantly moving. And how slowly or fast the energy moves will determine what our human perspective is of that. I'm sitting at my big cherry desk and it feels very solid, but I know I'm knocking on it to make the noise with the, how solid it is. But it also, I know that it's just energy that's just moving more slowly, perhaps, than the Wi-Fi energy that we're using to communicate right now in
Yeah.
this conversation. Really fascinating. I am an inventor of surgical devices sold throughout the world and former manufacturer. And so I've spent a lot of time in surgery over my 30 plus year career. And when I'm in there and I can scan remotely now, I always see angels in the OR, the operating room. I always see other spirits that are there, family spirits, deceased loved ones, pets. I also see surgeon spirits that will help the actual surgeons perform the operation. They're guiding them through the operation. And you referenced earlier, Tricia, that it was the angels didn't necessarily talk to you and you heard it with your ears. It sounds like it was more of a telepathic type of communication. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So what was so beautiful about it, it was almost like warm light that entered my soul. And I knew that first not to be afraid. It was almost like they gave me a little bit of preview of what the near-death experience was going to be like. And they also kind of seeded me more with what to expect for the rest of my life, like little bits of the future and little bits of maybe, how to hold on to certain bits of knowledge, when to talk, like as time went on, when to open up more as time goes on. And what's also interesting about all of this is I knew they were healers and I knew that they were teaching me something about the healing capacity of all of us and that this would be far more possible. And I think we're at the beginning and you tell me what you think, but I've heard from my angels in the past year that in the next 5 years we're going to make huge jumps with healing, that and a lot of it around light therapy, that the human what humans understand around healing. Our brains are going to open up in this. But there was a lot they told me, just that they couldn't put into words, but it was just like I felt comforted, about this experience. But they also just assured me they were working through the doctors and that it was so much more than the doctors. And I took from that they would work through me in that way as well. And I wasn't quite sure at that moment how, but I just understood that they would. And that gave me comfort because then some of the burden was off me. I could be the bozo and idiot that I am sometimes and still have the support of angels, still have the support of higher beings helping me, to keep everything on track.
Right. Spirit working through you and with you to help facilitate healing of the person with whom you're working. That's what I always say, because nobody heals anybody else. We all heal ourselves. No doctor, no healer, no whatever.
And that's something to pray for, is to pray that your angels work through someone. And another weird thing, and I've always found this like mysterious, my surgeon died a few years, and she was young, a few years after operating on me, and she was head of surgery at that hospital, and she died in a head-on collision. She was very adverse to talk about my near-death experience, but I do talk to her in spirit every once in a while, and I do think she probably is one of those surgeons that's coming back in spirit to assist others.
Well, I see them over the head of the actual surgeons. I see in my mind's eye them over the head. And I've had several doctors on the show, and I know lots of doctors, and especially surgeons. And I'll say, tell me about a time when you were in the operating room and everything looked okay, but you just had a feeling something wasn't right. And you made a move based on that gut feeling. And all of them have multiple stories like that. And all of them have stories about similar to what you went through. Somebody's coding on the table. I was in surgery one time and there was the surgeon was working on an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and it blew in the operating room. It ruptured. There was this fountain of blood that came shooting up out of the patient's chest. I was like, holy mother of God. So I'm starting to pray that surgeon saved that patient's life, and that patient completely recovered because he put his hand, he grabbed that aorta and he kept the patient from bleeding out. And I talked to him afterwards and I said, where'd that come from? He said, I don't know. He said, it was like I was a robot and I had been programmed. He said, I wasn't thinking, I was just working on rote energy. And I said to him, that was before I knew how to do woo-woo or knew any of this was going on in the operating room. And I said to him, do you think that was just God working through you? He said, no doubt. No doubt. He said, there's no way that patient should have lived. No way.
Yeah. There are those moments that are unexplainable. And when it's that unexplainable, how can it not be God? How can it not be something greater?
Right. Even coming from a former atheist, it's God, it's spirit, source, the universe, whatever you want to call it. So what else happened? You remembered the angels. You were gone for a couple of minutes. Did you experience anything else on the, quote, other side?
Oh, yes. So as I was leaving, and I loved Austin, I felt this love for everyone I'd ever known. And I just sent my love to everyone. And at that point, I was beginning to feel freedom. As you're flying, I think everyone wants to fly in lucid dreams. And it was just so much fun flying over that city. I didn't feel any fear. And I was just saying goodbye, in a way, and just sent my love as energy. And then I transitioned really quickly into what I call like space. And it's so bizarre because these images from the James Webb telescope are coming back. And for so long, I've had this one image in my mind of where I was. And I was just floating in this beautiful area. And I was like, how can I have gone from Austin to millions of light years away, like that quickly? But it just seemed like I went through a tunnel and then I was there, just like that. And there I was floating in the stars, and it was beautiful. And again, no fear, just complete peace. And I began to get some messages from a higher consciousness, which I do call God. But at first it just felt like higher intelligence. And these messages were very simple. Just, hey, love is all that you take with you when you go. So when you leave that realm, all you take with you is love. And other messages were remind them to go to nature. And I was like, well, these are really simple messages. If I'm going back, this is all I'm bringing back. I was starting to get a little worried, like no mathematical formulas. No, be like a little child was another message. And then I got to transition into this realm where everything was made new again. So to me, this is a holding place, but it kind of looked like heaven, or some people's idea of heaven. To me,
can you describe it for us?
Yeah, it was perfect. So if you think of like summer grass and how it turns there's like here in Texas, it gets brown, like because the sun is beating down on it. And there it was perfectly green. Everything had no death. All of nature was emerald green. There were colors I'd never seen before. The trees were perfect. Everything was kind of swaying almost musically, just like pure joy. Nature was full of pure joy, harmony, bliss. And my grandfather was there. And I remember not recognizing him at first. He kind of has a jaw like mine, kind of a square jaw. Looks a little bit like me in a way, same color eyes and hair. And he looked about 35. And I was like, oh, grandfather, and because he had died of leukemia in his 70s. And that's how I remember him as a 10-year-old kid. But he looked so healthy and vibrant and young. And I knew he was a country guy. And, he had this truck he had given my dad. And the truck sat in our yard. It was a 1965 Chevy truck, and very cool truck had it been remade. but it wasn't. And there in heaven, it was perfectly blue and new. And I remember thinking, how can that truck be rusted in the yard and here in heaven? And he's like, everything is remade and new here, just like me, so is the truck. And so, anything that you want to be remade new, you can have it remade new. And I became like a little child. So then I realized, well, if he can be young again, I can be young. So instead of 21, I was 5 there, and I shrugged myself, and it felt good to be like a kid with my grandfather. And I spent some time in that realm, but not very long, because there was this moment where, as I was riding in the back of the truck and he was driving, he turned to me and he said, "Do you want to keep going?" And I got this sense, you just know things. You don't have to say it. And it's like he was talking to God, and God said, "Oh, there is this chance she may not make it. And so she can keep going." And so I think the surgery was getting dicey, and so I got to travel onward towards God. And immediately, I was like, yes, I want to go towards God. And as I was going there, I felt people's prayers trying to pull me back. And I could feel who was praying very sincerely and who was praying for what. And, prayers are just an energy. They're just a wind. And that's the way it felt. And I was a stronger wind going towards God. So I didn't even care. I was just blowing through their wind, because I saw God up ahead, or the light, creator, whatever you want to call it. I sense the light as an intelligence greater than me, a love greater than me. And that was the thing. I never felt better. And so as I got closer and closer to that light, everything that had made me feel uncomfortable, and honestly, I still feel uncomfortable. I don't think anyone feels totally comfortable in the body. There's always some pain, or there's always some, thirsty, or I'm hungry, or want a nap, or, I need something. We always feel a little unsettled, a little anxious, I think, in the body. Not there. Like there was nothing other than joy and happiness and bliss and total emotional comfort. So there was no need for self-care. You were totally unconditionally loved, cared for, perfect as you are. Finally loved, like finally everything was perfect, fine. There was no pain. And for once I felt good. And once I realized that, I was like, I'm not going back. No way. There's no thing on earth I'm coming back to. No way, no how. Forget it. Forget those people's prayers. Don't even remember them. I'm staying here with you, God. A time is relative. I'll see them soon enough. Forget it. Like everything just didn't matter at that point. I wanted to stay with God. And the minute I had that thought, I was stopped. It was almost like there was this energetic wall, and I couldn't go any further. And I heard a booming voice, and people, think of God's voice as masculine, but it was more like a rumble that came from inside me. And it wasn't really masculine or feminine. It was just loud. And it was, undeniable is what I would call it. And the voice said, "Look down." And so I looked down, and I saw this earth, and I saw a river, and kind of zoned in on the river. And I saw all these people walking along a river, and some of them had fear around them, and some of them had light around them. And the people who had fear, it was as if the light said, you're going to remind them how to live without fear, how to turn on their lights, and how to be more in that flow of their joy and their happiness. And you're going to do this as a teacher. And I was like, as a what? As a teacher? No. Oh, that's not what I want to do for a career. You're going to make me come back and teach? No way. And I argued for a little bit of time, but I saw, I got a vision of how this would work, and, the different age groups, and not at first spiritual teacher, really teacher in public schools, different age groups, and then college, and then kind of the world, at in a larger way, but mostly the most important work would be with kids and with teenagers. And I remember thinking, oh, this is a little harder than I expected. This is not necessarily what I wanted. And the minute I thought that, it was almost as if this intelligence kind of laughed at me, like, you don't get it. You really don't get it at all. This isn't for them. This is for you. And balled me up, my soul, and kind of threw me back into myself. And it took me many years. I mean, really, almost a couple of decades to finally get it. But I kind of fast forwarding way into the future, I realized after about 2 decades of teaching, I'm always happy. Like, I'm always happy when I'm teaching. There isn't a moment when I'm not like kind of joyful, because I think there is some light, or there is some assistance working through me, or at least kind of supporting me at the very least.
So you got put together in a ball and thrown back into your body. And then what happened? You woke up and you were in the recovery room?
Yes. And, there's interviewed a lot of near-death experiencers. Some of them don't remember their experiences, but for whatever reason, I remembered mine like immediately as soon as I came out of anesthesia. And in high school, a friend of ours who had done drugs, and he had one of these near-death experiences, and he came back like very awakened and like very different, like all shiny and new, and I was like, ooh, I'm gonna be like him now. I'm different, and people are gonna not understand this. And so I knew what had happened to me. I started talking to it, and yeah, some people were skeptical. Some people called it the morphine that they were giving me. Some people said, oh, it's anesthesia, or, oh, you just had a blood transfusion. And people kept trying to discredit me. But actually, my grandmother, who was Catholic, listened because of the angels. A couple of friends who were spiritual came in, at different times and listened. And so the people who did listen, thank God, my father, he believed me. There was this kind of intuitive knowing, I guess he always had. He served in Vietnam, and he said he held a lot of his friends when they were dying, and he had this knowing of life and death. And he said he knew that I had crossed at some point, and he was happy I was alive, and it wasn't my time to go. And so there were people who understood, but there were some people who didn't. And my mom believed my story was not of God, because it didn't follow the Bible exactly. And so there were some arguments around that. It was disappointing.
Was your granddad your paternal or your maternal grandfather? And was the grandmother that believed you and listened to your story, was that her husband, or was it your other grandmother?
It was, so both of my grandfathers were over there, but I never met my maternal grandfather. So my maternal grandmother believed me, but my dad's dad was the one who was over there. And my dad's mom had Alzheimer's at the time, and so she couldn't come to the hospital, but she died shortly after that too.
So it was your paternal grandfather with the blue truck.
Yes.
I love that story. I'm not sure I've heard that before, that once somebody was in heaven during their NDE, that they were transported in a vehicle. Normally it will be somebody is, walking alongside, or you're propelled somewhere. But to me, that's a frame of reference for you to let you know, okay, this is really me, and I'm going to show you this blue truck that was my truck. I love that part of the equation.
And
yeah.
I love it too, that everything that we think is lost is not lost, that it can be made new again, even a truck. People always think that, we see our pets, we even get to see our trucks,
That'll make my husband, who loves talking about his 57 Chevy, very happy when I tell him that here later this evening. Oh, funny. Correlation between prayer and spirits, Tricia. It's been my experience thousands of times in scanning somebody that's in surgery. I can do remote viewing in the OR, and I know what's going on. A lot of times I can read the anesthesia equipment. I can tell you how many surgeons are actually working on the patient. I can tell you the guardian angel of the patient is over the head of anesthesia. There are surgeon spirits over the head. There are other angels in the room, lots of deceased loved ones, even spirits of pets sometimes. But there's always a correlation between, in my experience, there's always a correlation between how much prayer is being said for that person and the number of spirits that are in the operating room. And inevitably, I'll say, my God, there were so many spirits in the OR. Did you have a lot of people praying for you? And they'll say, yeah, I got myself on every prayer chain, from here to kingdom come. And it's really obvious. It's fascinating to me that you could hear the prayers being said for you. And then that correlates with what I've experienced as well. And both being in the operating room back when I was developing and manufacturing surgical devices, and certainly since then from a remote standpoint. So that's interesting too. You say when you were on the other side, you were instructed to remind people to act as a child. What does that mean to you? What did it mean to you then? And what does it mean to you now after all these years?
You know how children kind of look at the world as though there aren't that many predators. I mean, we teach them to be wary of people, but children are kind of open-armed and let's play, let's have fun, let's meet one another with joy. And I think that if we could meet one another with less judgment and more let's play, let's have joy together, I think we'd have a much better experience. And oddly enough, telling this story in crowds of people does bring back that joy. I can't tell you how many times I've been at a party or gathering and someone will say, oh, I heard you had an air. Tell me about it. And then everyone starts talking about the afterlife or ghosts or things, and everyone has a smile. And, people forget about other things. They have their imaginations lit up, or, their childlike self. And suddenly, we're different. I think when we're talking about spiritual things, or when we're talking about the imagination, or when we're talking about something that brings us joy. So at the very least, when we're able to access our joy, or more like children, when we're able to play, when we're able to imagine things, when we're able to get out of the mundane, the routine, the drudgery of life, the routine of, jobs and that kind of thing. But children forgive easy, and they don't drag the truckload of their trauma and their past behind them. They have faith, and they have faith is very easy for them. They believe. And I think that's important, whether it's healing, whether it is believing in other people, believing in redemption and forgiveness. And one thing that really has struck me as a near-death experiencer, people will email me often and they'll say, hey, I'm dying and I've lived a terrible life. Is there any hope for me? And I will say, it is never too late to forgive or to ask for forgiveness. Even if someone says no, at least you tried. And 10 years from now, that person may look at that email and they might be ready then. That forgiveness is something that you can always you can always offer an apology, and it can always set out there. If it's heartfelt, forgiveness is something that can happen, that it is something that can set people free. And, I think of all the horrific things that are done on this planet and all the things that people have never even apologized for, so at least please apologize, at least, show that you've thought it through on your deathbed, that it's worth it. But children forgive, children give people a chance to be different, to see things differently, to leave that past behind. And what I know of the other side, we do leave it behind, which is such a gift, and maybe children know that we don't take all that with us. We don't take the trauma of what's been done to us. And we also don't take the horror of, whatever darkness we've done. We get to leave that behind too. So we can both forgive others and forgive ourselves.
Yeah, it's been my experience that the personality of the spirit stays with the body when somebody dies. It's also been my experience everybody goes to heaven, and I've heard that a bazillion times from spirit. Everybody goes to heaven. It's like we're playing a role. You referenced that earlier. And it's like, okay, we're watching a movie or we're in a play, and the most horrific person that you can think of, mass murder or whatever. And people have a tough time with that because, especially in our Judeo-Christian Western culture, we think, oh, they're going to go burn in hell for forever. Nobody burns in hell. Hell doesn't exist. All spirits go to heaven. All spirits are pure love. And it's been my experience as well that in spirit form, in heaven, I call it heaven, our deceased loved ones and our spirit guides and all of them are watching us going, oh, look at this with Tricia. What's she going to do to create out of this? Isn't this interesting? How's she going to progress? How's her spirit going to expand? What decision is she going to make? All that kind of stuff. And looking at our lives with the sense of childlike wonder. Even the spirits from heaven are going, oh, wow, she's been in this car accident. How's she going to get out of it? What's going to happen? Who's going to operate on her? All of that. I've heard that many, many times as well. And certainly, who are the most curious beings? Well, it's a toddler or a little child, especially when they're mobile. What do? They go pick up a toy. They smell it, they chew on it, they lick it, they, feel it, they look at it, and then they throw it and they're on to the next toy. It's like, okay, I got that. Let's go to the next thing. So I love that you say that with the childlike wonder.
And then they believe in what's possible. And I think we need to keep opening up to what's possible. For us, as we evolve and not limiting it. And I think that's kind of exciting.
Well, and to your point earlier too, where it's a situation where they haven't been taught that it's wrong. They're just experiencing it for the pure experience. And certainly that's how we learn, but we haven't been taught. And it's been my experience, too, that every little child, we all come in with the ability to be intuitive and psychic ability. And then when children start to turn it off is when their grown-ups say, oh, honey, that's just your imagination. That's not really real. So you teach now. Tell us about what you teach and how you incorporate all of this experience that you've had when you were in the accident 20 years ago and had your NDE. How do you incorporate it into just your daily life in teaching, especially since those were your marching orders before you came back into your body?
It might have been a little more difficult if I was teaching math, but I teach English, poetry, and stories about people living and dying. It's pretty easy with themes. And when you teach literature, for example, Walt Whitman, pretty easy to teach the near-death experience when you teach transcendentalism. And he has certain lines in his poetry. Lines such as the one about some people believe it is just as lucky to be born as it is to die. And I explain, why I think it is just as lucky to have died and to die. That to me, it was opening up this other realm. And I also, I just tell the story directly to students because it's out there at this point. I have a social media following and that sort of thing. And we talk about writing stories. And so I say, hey, maybe you don't have this type of story, but this is how I wrote my story. This is what I chose to include. You can write about trauma in this way, and you can write about inspirational stories in this way, and frame it in this way to inspire people. But mostly I just tell the story to them directly because I think it is always important to tell a near-death experience story to a crowd. And over the years, I mean, it never failed to every class, there'd be one or two students who had something similar. So I was surprised that many students had a medical condition, but I've had many military students, coming through my classrooms at the college level, the community college level. And so lots of people have had out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences. And many students have battled cancer, as children and come back, to live and tell about it. Maybe they didn't have a near-death experience, but they had, great faith so that they were going to overcome it, or, they've had some sort of traumatic moment in their life, or they had a grandparent who died, or a ghost experience. So there's always been some sort of connection, or they're just spiritual, or they have gifts. The weirdest thing has happened since the pandemic. Most of my students, I'd say half of my students understand all this now. So now we're just a classroom.
What's the catalyst with the pandemic? How's that work?
Oh, everyone's tried meditation. So I think they got bored during the pandemic. So this is community college students. So a lot of different things. Almost everyone tried meditation. A lot of students told me they tried psilocybin or different things for depression, sometimes ketamine therapy, sometimes just deep meditation practices and things kind of outside of the box. So sometimes they just awakened on their own, they were so shocked by, what was going on in the world and isolated that they began to think deeply in their time alone. So there's been a real spiritual change in this group of students. Although they're dealing with anxiety, they got curious. They started watching a lot more videos about spirituality. And I'm not talking to the choir, or I'm not talking to people who don't understand this. I'm kind of talking to the choir now, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I bet. What happens when people insist on being right? Whether that's about religion or politics or just a cultural thing, what does that do to us? And what do you think happens in the long run with that?
When you think about thousands of years ago and you think about culture or politics thousands of years ago, what does it really even matter? What lasts? That's something I often think about. Kindness in the moment, I think, is what lasts, and love is what lasts. And so whenever we can rise above the moments of argument, and whenever we can choose nonviolent resistance to violence, and stopping violence, whenever we can choose to create a more peaceful society, I think that's important, whenever we can move connection forward and joy forward, because I believe the majority of people who, just want love and peace and success for their families. And I think it's large government and political leaders that want war and division. And I think the mass amounts of people have always wanted safety and just happiness and joy, that they don't necessarily want war. And so the mass amount of people probably don't want conflict if you really look within your heart. I think it's very, very sad, this choosing conflict over family. And it's often who you wouldn't think it would be. Within my own family, the very people who are the family values people are the ones who are drop kicking their kids to the side, because of differences of opinions through social media and Facebook. And it's quite bizarre. And I wish it wouldn't happen. I wish that we could take a clue from older generations who in many ways kind of stepped aside from politics and religion and said, let's just eat together. Like, let's just enjoy the meal and talk about the dog, and then, go our separate ways.
Yeah. Along those lines, I read that you say it's better to read the news than to watch the news. Say more about that.
As an empath, I think it's hard for people to absorb it's hard for me to absorb a lot of the images. And I think we're more easily manipulated by images than we are by facts and statistics. And if you read things that are more moderate or right over the wire, then you can make your own inferences. If you want to just stay up to date on what's happening around the world, it's a lot easier to read things right off AP, right off the wire, than it is to read things that are, or look at things that are polarized or editorialized or have some sort of spin. Just make your own inferences and be aware of language. And also, that one thing that made me kind of laugh is there are some people who, like, take, for instance, Hare Krishnas, who say you became a Hare Krishna in 1970, you might not have seen any news since 1970. And, think how many times the world ended. The world was about to end since 1970. The only news you might have been curious enough to watch might have been during the pandemic. That might have been it. Literally. And so many times we think, that the world is on the verge of chaos and there's so much that we absolutely must tune into. Really, the spiritual journey is always going on. And so how much of that are you willing to give energy to? I used to think, people who aren't watching the news are not informed, and how can you not be informed about the world? But now I kind of look at it differently. It's as if I'm choosing to focus on the light that I'm creating and choosing to focus on the light that I want to bring to this world. And I'd rather give energy to that. And I'd rather give energy to that in a local way and do what I actually can, because there's not much I can do, for global forces, but there are things I can do in a local way.
Interesting. You were given a message about world peace from a world leader, no less, the spirit of a world leader. Please tell us about that.
Yeah, that was an odd one. Right after my near-death experience, when I didn't realize that I could channel various people for a short amount of time or little bits of time. When Yitzhak Rabin died, I went into meditation and I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I understood that this was going to shift politics in Israel, and that, this was just an important moment, that he was a symbol of peace that had gone awry, but that he knew that he wasn't actually creating peace, and that he was just simply trying to put a face on peace in that moment. And that he understood that. And in that moment, he was saying, his basic message was that there has to be a tipping point in all of the Middle East, that everyone, when there are more people who want peace than not, then there will be peace. And so that's on both sides. So when the majority of people want peace, there will be peace. And so you have to just hold peace in your heart. And so it's not enough for a leader to put on a face and make a show and, say, we have a peace accord. That really, all people have to step forward and say, or at least the majority of people have to say, we want peace. We do. And say it and believe it and not be afraid to say it publicly, to the leaders. And that's dangerous at times, to just even say that. Because sometimes it's not supporting your leaders, I think, to say you want peace,
Interesting that a cute little blonde girl from Austin, Texas got that message from, the Prime Minister of Israel. I think that's...
It was like, why me? And I think he was kind of like, why you? Well, I think he was like, well, for some reason you're tuning in. It was like, it was just that moment. It was like no one else was asking him as he was ascending. And, it's just so strange. Like there's just these weird moments where people sometimes don't stop to think. It's like they're mourning, but they don't stop to actually connect or ask. And so maybe it's a message to others, when someone famous or well-known dies, ask them, like as they're ascending.
Yeah. Well, every spirit, it's been my experience, every spirit has a frequency they keep throughout all their lifetimes. And in order to connect with them, we just think of them. Our heads are like big satellite dishes that tune to that person's frequency, whether they're alive or not, whether we knew them or not is irrelevant. You want to have a conversation with Elvis, you think of Elvis, and you'll be able to do the same thing that you did then.
Don't you think musicians do that like unconsciously? Like they, I'm inspired by Elvis, but really they're, picking their guitar and they're getting a little of him,
Yeah. Well, every author, every composer, every screenwriter, every artist, they were all channeling information. I know when you wrote your book, I would be willing to bet there were times where you wrote something and you went back and you read it and you thought, I don't really remember writing this, but it's pretty good. Kind of a thing. Every author I know, including myself, says that happens throughout the whole writing process. You also say that we are greatly blessed, and we're greatly blessed as we bless others. What do you mean by that?
That's part of the angels working through us and the light working through us. And that's really what I learned as I became a teacher. I realized that God wanted me to go into teaching because there were so many wounds that I had. Like I had been bullied at different times in school. So as I worked with bullies and found, different ways to help kids who were bullied and help bullies become aware of what they were doing and become more self-aware, that I was stopping a problem, healing a problem, and healing it within me just by seeing it and doing something about it, since something hadn't been done, at times in my case, that it allowed me to see into a problem and heal it. And that was, it was beautiful. I mean, there were these moments of, there were so many different moments, but there were also these moments of, thank God I was there, because there were sometimes these moments when teachers were just not aware of what was going on. And, no fault to them, but I think there was just a lack of understanding, I think, of what kids go through. And maybe they didn't understand certain things, or they didn't take the time to ask questions of what children and some kids actually go through. But I had enough intuition, or I was meant to be there, in those cases. Perhaps it was even a soul plan, that I was there in those cases, and
yeah. Interesting. If you had to choose one, just one, what would be the most influential aspect of your NDE, and how is it affecting your current life today?
Oh, man. If there's one aspect I would like to give to all people, I think it would be that knowing of how deeply we're loved. And I think every near-death experiencer tends to say that, like, if we could just download it and, put it in a, kind of like, how everyone's going crazy with Ozempic, if we could just like inject God's love into us, like on a daily basis, you wouldn't need anything else. Like you wouldn't need any drugs. You wouldn't need anything. Just get your daily dose of God. Like you wouldn't need an antidepressant. There would be nothing that you need. Like seriously, that you would just walk around feeling great, feeling satisfied, feeling like you are cared for, that everything is perfect as it is, that you could leave right this moment or live to be 100 and everything is fine. And I think that kind of certainty would just be such a relief for so many people, because everyone worries about every little thing in their life. But to know that you are that taken care of, that you're fine no matter what, I mean, that's great news.
So it's kind of like, lighten up, Francis.
It's way better than you think.
Yeah. And so you don't take things as seriously, I would imagine, as you did before you had your accident and your NDE.
Yeah, there are moments, when I do, and I forget, but in general, I tend to come back and laugh.
Yeah. Why do we incarnate?
We really like learning lessons. I think that's the main thing, and we are noble. Honestly, that's part of this. We want to help. I believe that there's a big drive in so many of us to learn certain lessons. Well, it all depends on the soul. Like, I can talk to my dad over there and I ask him why he wants to come back, because he wants to come back and he wants to sign up for a similar journey and he wants to just do it a little better. He's like, I didn't do it as well as I could have. I know I can do it better. I'm going to sign up for a similar journey because not everybody wants to do, the same thing, but I do. And this time I'm going to be a musician. This time I'm going to teach people certain things. So he really, he has, it's almost like his soul has his own markers and he wants to just hit a better note and just get better at it. So we forget a lot and he wants to get better at remembering. And so I think that's maybe part of it, is the remembering.
Mm-hmm. You've referenced several times during this conversation that you're communicating with spirit. How do you do that now? And did you do it before your NDE?
Oh no, I would have thought that was nuts. I sat on buses in Austin and I saw the, homeless schizophrenics, and, I would have been, terrified if I did that. So no. And I honestly, I didn't really do it too often. It would come in, like as angel communication or particular moments in the classroom, and I'd use it very specifically at times. It wasn't until my dad died that I started getting it really frequently from him. And then other people started asking me to do it for them. And I very reluctantly started doing mediumship work, and then it just evolves. But I will say that you can do this and your ancestors are there and they do want to help you if you're in danger, if you need something, at your happy moments, at your delicate moments. And I've seen it happen in many people's lives. And then the people who are in deep grief, I feel for them, but I have to keep reminding them, like, grief kind of separates you from love. And it's not the same vibration. So you kind of have to get through grief before you get back to those feelings of love, to feel some of those feelings come through. And that's the hard part.
So what's your technique? Do you just think of them and then you say something to them, either aloud or in your head? What are you doing to communicate with them?
I usually close my eyes, but I see sometimes like a picture, an image. I hear different things. So I don't like visually see them. Only once or twice has that happened. Usually that's a little alarming. But it began this I think I'll just call him a fraud, but this medium was reading for me and he just had my dad all wrong. And I saw my dad like behind him going, no, you can do this. He's wrong. And I was like, oh, okay. and then from that point on, I just could hear my dad.
Yeah. Okay. So your dad's helping you from heaven.
Yeah.
It sounds like too.
Yeah. And he's funny. Yeah. I can hear him. He'll pop in.
Mm-hmm.
And people hear their ancestors in different ways. Some people love to ask for signs, and I hear from people all the time. One quick funny one, like people always say, I saw my ancestor as a bird. And so I'm like, well, how many people can see a cardinal that's their ancestor? But this one woman said she asked for her dad to come as a cardinal. She was cleaning out this Airbnb that she owned. And she turned around and there was a cardinal sitting on the TV that her dad used to watch all the time. And I was like, no, that was your dad. Like, no one can deny that was your dad.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You are such a delight. What a fun, interesting, enlightening conversation we've had here today, my girl. How can people learn more about you and your work?
Oh, you can find me at Tricia, Tricia Barker, NDE.com. And I'd love to connect with you in a reading or in spiritual community. You can find me on my contact there or catch some of my videos on YouTube. It would be fun to connect with you.
Yeah, and tell everybody about your book.
Oh, yeah. My book, Angels in the OR, came out a few years ago, and it is a memoir, a lot more than just a near-death experience, but some of the teaching adventures and recovery from trauma and that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking the time to join us today and share some of your life and heavenly experiences with all of us. Everybody, that's it for today. Sending you lots of love from Sweet Home, Alabama. Mwah! And from Texas, too, where Tricia is. We'll see you next time. To enhance your spiritual journey, click on one of the videos below and remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and share with your family and friends.